Before the world learned to divide itself into neat shelves of meaning, there was no sharp edge between what happened and what was told. There was only experience, unfolding day after day, woven from hunger, weather, fear, birth, and loss. Humans did not stand outside their lives to explain them. They were inside them, moving with rhythms that returned again and again, until repetition itself became understanding. In this earlier way of being, memory was not a record but a living presence. What mattered was not when something happened, but how often it returned. The rising of stars, the swelling of rivers, the arrival of animals, the aging of elders, all carried instruction. Knowledge survived because it was tied to survival. To forget the pattern was to risk death. Meaning therefore came first, long before explanation followed. What modern minds would later call gods were not distant figures perched beyond the sky. They were felt in wind that flattened crops, in fire that warmed and destroyed, in leaders whose decisions shaped entire clans. Authority and nature were inseparable. A storm did not need a story to justify it, and a story did not need proof to be true. The world spoke through events, and humans listened with attention sharpened by necessity. There was no concept of fiction in such a world. A tale about the past was not entertainment, it was a warning, a memory compressed so it could travel intact through time. Symbols were not decorations. They were tools. A carved shape, a repeated chant, a ritual performed at the right season, carried instructions too complex for ordinary speech. These forms endured because they worked. Only much later would language begin to harden. As generations stretched further from their origins, direct memory weakened. What had once been lived started to sound like something heard. The shift was quiet, almost invisible, but its effects were permanent. Stories slowly loosened from events. Meaning stayed, while context faded. What remained felt ancient, powerful, and oddly distant, even though it had begun as something familiar. To modern ears, this distance now feels like myth. Yet myth, in its earliest form, was not invention. It was memory surviving in a harsher landscape of forgetting. It carried truth, not in precise detail, but in shape and direction. It told people how the world behaved, not why it behaved that way. The question of explanation had not yet become urgent. This is the world before categories, before humans learned to separate sacred from ordinary, story from fact, symbol from event, a world where understanding did not require proof, only attention. To enter it now requires unlearning habits built over centuries. It means loosening the grip on certainty and allowing ambiguity to breathe. Because once the separation dissolves, a quieter and more unsettling question begins to form. If myth and history were once the same thing, then the beings remembered within that shared reality were not imaginary at all. They were understood differently, through presence rather than belief. And understanding them may require stepping even deeper into that forgotten way of seeing. This earlier mindset did not measure existence with distance or doubt. It accepted that life was layered, that forces could be seen and unseen without conflict. Nothing demanded final answers. Curiosity lived comfortably beside acceptance. In that openness, humans did not ask whether something was real or symbolic. Those questions had no meaning yet. They only asked whether it mattered, whether it guided action, whether it kept people alive through another night. From that space, everything felt closer, heavier, and more intimate. The ground beneath memory had not fractured. And it is from here, from this unbroken closeness, that the next question naturally rises, drawing attention toward the beings who moved within that shared world, and how they were perceived before names hardened into myth. This understanding quietly prepares the listener for what comes next. Before names hardened into distance, the sacred moved quietly through ordinary life. It did not announce itself with thunderous entrances or demand belief. It appeared through familiar faces, inherited authority, and forces that shaped daily survival. Early humans did not kneel before ideas. They responded to presence. What we now describe as gods were experienced as participants in the same world, bound to land, bloodlines, and responsibility. Leaders were not simply rulers. They carried weight because something moved through them. Decisions were watched closely, not only by people, but by the unseen order believed to guide outcomes. A successful harvest confirmed favor. A failed one suggested withdrawal. Healers spoke words learned through lineage, gestures passed down as carefully as tools. Sky watchers observed movement above not as curiosity, but as communication. Patterns in light and shadow were read like messages, not metaphors. In such cultures, encounters with the sacred were not stories told later. They were events recorded through memory and repetition. A mountain that shook was not symbolic of anger. It was anger. A voice carried by wind was not imagination. It was instruction. When something extraordinary happened, it was folded into daily understanding, not separated from it. The world did not need interpretation. It already spoke in a language everyone was trained to hear. Lineage mattered deeply because it carried proximity. To descend from a figure touched by the sacred was to inherit authority without question. Blood was evidence. Names were anchors. The past remained close because it lived inside families and rituals that repeated it into the present. Memory did not fade easily when it walked beside you. This intimacy shaped how societies organized themselves. Power did not flow from abstraction, but from perceived alignment. Those closest to the sacred guided law, movement, and conflict. This was not worship as later ages would define it. It was coordination. To live well meant to move in harmony with forces already accepted as real. Modern minds often search for proof, asking whether these beings existed as described, but that question would have felt meaningless then. Reality was measured by consequence, not verification. If something changed behavior, shaped survival, and demanded response, it was real enough to matter. Over time, distance crept in. As generations passed, fewer people felt the presence directly. What had once been encountered began to be remembered. The sacred did not vanish, but it stepped back, becoming something approached through ritual rather than experience. This shift was gentle, almost unnoticed, yet it marked the beginning of a transformation. When memory slowly replaces encounter, certainty softens. What was once lived side by side becomes something spoken of. The sacred rises upward, not because it leaves, but because humans lose the closeness required to meet it directly. And in that growing distance, a new need quietly emerges. The need to record, to preserve, and to explain what can no longer be touched. This moment marks a turning rarely noticed in hindsight. Once experience becomes memory, memory seeks structure. Sounds become symbols, presences become names. What was known through closeness now demands explanation through language. The sacred, once beside the ordinary, begins its slow ascent into distance, not through departure, but through translation. Humans begin to point where they once stood. They describe instead of respond. In doing so, they protect fragments of the old world, but they also change it. Every retelling stretches the space between encounter and listener. Every repetition smooths the edges of urgency. What remains still feels powerful, yet increasingly remote. It is here, in this quiet shift, that the conditions for history are formed. Records will soon replace memory, marks will stand in for voices, and events will be ordered instead of felt. Nothing is lost all at once. The sacred does not disappear in collapse, but in careful steps away from the everyday. And as this distance grows, another question waits just beneath the surface, patient and unresolved, asking how humans would come to understand these beings once closeness gave way to memory. This pause invites attention forward, because the next transformation will not erase the sacred, but redefine how it is perceived, remembered, and eventually recorded within emerging systems of human order. The change did not arrive as a break. It came as a thinning. With each passing generation, fewer people had stood inside the original events. Fewer had heard the voices directly, or felt the weight of presence without explanation. Experience still guided life, but it no longer belonged to everyone. Memory began to stretch, and in that stretch, something subtle shifted. Repetition became the anchor. What could no longer be lived had to be spoken again and again to survive. Words were chosen carefully, shaped by rhythm and sound, so they would hold attention and endure travel. Chants, gestures, and stories emerged not to entertain, but to carry weight across distance and time. A truth remembered once could fade. A truth repeated became durable. Slowly, events hardened into narratives. What had been recalled as something witnessed became something told, not because anyone intended to distort it, but because memory obeys different rules than experience. Details that no longer guided survival loosened their grip. Patterns remained. Meaning was preserved by compression, the way a vast landscape can be reduced into a symbol without losing its direction. Fear played a quiet role in this transformation. Loss followed migration. Collapse erased landmarks. Death removed those who remembered most clearly. Forgetting became a threat equal to hunger or cold. To forget was to repeat mistakes without warning. Stories answered this fear. They condensed memory into forms small enough to carry when everything else was left behind. This was the birth of myth. Though it did not feel like creation at the time, it felt like preservation. Myth was not designed to deceive or embellish. It was a tool built under pressure. It allowed memory to cross generations that no longer shared context. It kept instructions alive, even when reasons were gone. Over time, the tone of memory changed. What had once been spoken with certainty acquired a distance that sounded like imagination. Listeners who had never experienced the original events heard them differently. The story remained powerful, but its grounding softened. It began to float free of location, then of time. This was not decay, it was adaptation. Here lies the first unsettling realization. Myth may not be fiction layered onto history. It may be history after context has been stripped away. The core remains, but its surroundings are gone. What is left feels symbolic, because the conditions that made it concrete no longer exist. Something vital was lost in this shift, not truth, but closeness. Experience binds tightly. Narrative creates space. In that space, interpretation grows. Authority can enter. Meaning can be redirected. None of this happened suddenly. It unfolded as gently as forgetting itself. By the time memory fully hardened into story, humanity had gained something and surrendered something in return. The past became portable, but also vulnerable. It could now be shaped, ordered, and eventually recorded. And with that possibility, a new chapter quietly began. One where memory would no longer drift freely, but would be captured, fixed, and defined by those who chose what deserved to remain. From this point forward, remembering would never again be innocent. Once stories could be carried without witnesses, they could also be rearranged. What was emphasized gained weight, what was omitted slowly vanished. Memory, now externalized, invited stewardship, and stewardship, however gentle, always carries intention. This was the threshold humanity crossed without ceremony, where the past became something that could be handled rather than inhabited. The transformation felt necessary, even protective, yet it opened a path that would continue widening with every generation. Soon, voices would seek permanence in marks, and marks would claim authority over living recollection. The fluid past would begin to settle, and as it settled, it would invite those who believed they could organize it, shaping remembrance into something fixed, something legible, and something that could be controlled. This quiet shift prepared the ground for the first recorded histories ahead. When marks were first pressed into clay, humanity discovered a way to make moments endure beyond breath. Writing felt like a miracle because it held memory still, fixing voices that would otherwise fade with the speaker. Yet this new power carried an unseen cost. The instant experience was translated into symbols. It stopped moving. What was written could travel far, but it could no longer change. Early writing was not a neutral mirror. It demanded selection. Only certain moments were worth the labor of carving, pressing, inscribing. Those choices rarely belonged to everyone. Record-keeping fell to priests, elders, officials, and scribes who stood closest to authority. What they chose to preserve gained weight. What remained unwritten slowly slipped into silence. Oral memory had once carried texture. It allowed contradiction, tone, context, and living response. Writing compressed these qualities into lines that appeared precise, yet hid complexity beneath their clarity. Sacred encounters that once felt present were pushed backward into distant beginnings. Gods became ancestors. Events became origins. What had been lived beside was relocated far away. This shift quietly reshaped reality. If something was written, it became official. If it was not, it became questionable. Legend was born not because stories were false, but because they were unrecorded. Writing established borders around truth. not by denying memory, but by overshadowing it. Symbols began to outlive the experiences that gave them meaning. Authority grew naturally from permanence. A tablet endured longer than a voice. A mark could be copied, referenced, enforced. Over time, what was written felt older and more reliable than what was remembered, even when memory had once been closer to the source. History did not emerge as an open record of the past, but as a curated one, shaped by fear of loss and desire for control. This transformation was not malicious, it was human. Societies facing growth and instability needed anchors. Writing provided structure in a world becoming too large for shared memory alone. Yet structure required exclusion. Not everything could be written, not everyone could read. Meaning narrowed as access tightened. As generations passed, the written word gained authority simply by surviving. Context eroded, rituals lost explanation, stories hardened into doctrine. What began as preservation became definition. The past was no longer something negotiated through living voices, but something consulted through symbols that could not respond. The weight of this change lingered quietly. Writing did not just store memory, it redirected it. Once experiences were filtered through permanent marks, they could be reorganized, ranked, and revised. The act of recording became an act of choice. And choice, repeated often enough, became tradition. From this moment forward, human memory would no longer drift freely. It would be bounded by what could be inscribed and who was permitted to inscribe it. Writing did not erase myth, it reframed it. The sacred was pushed further into the past, safer, quieter, and easier to manage. What remained looked orderly, authoritative, and complete, even as much of its original meaning faded from view. And in that appearance of permanence, a new distinction began to form, one that would reshape how humans understood truth itself. It would take time before this new order was questioned. At first, writing felt like protection, a shield against loss. But every shield casts a shadow. As marks replaced memory, distance grew between people and the origins of their own stories. Interpretation began to settle into the spaces where experience once lived. The written past appeared settled, finished, beyond dispute. Yet beneath its surface, something essential waited, unchanged but unheard. A tension formed between what was remembered and what was recorded, and that tension would only grow. Soon, memory itself would be organized, guarded, and claimed. And with that claim, the boundaries of history would harden, preparing the way for new distinctions, new authorities, and a quieter, forgetting that felt like progress, even as it pulled. The separation did not arrive with fire or declaration. It arrived quietly, carried by necessity rather than announcement. As human groups expanded, layered, and settled into lasting structures, the closeness once shared with the sacred became difficult to manage. Presence demands response. Authority demands distance. What had once walked beside ordinary life slowly rose upward, not through disappearance, but through repositioning. Former ancestors, culture heroes, and sky kings were lifted out of reach. They were no longer remembered as participants, but reframed as origins. Their actions were pushed back beyond living memory, placed at the beginning of time, where they could no longer interfere with the present. This shift calmed uncertainty. If the gods were distant, their silence required no explanation. If they belonged to a finished age, they could not be questioned. Power stabilized around this distance. Rulers no longer needed to contend with sacred figures moving unpredictably through the world. Instead, they could speak on their behalf. Authority flowed downward from the unreachable. If divine instruction could not be encountered directly, it had to be interpreted. Those closest to interpretation gained influence. The gods did not vanish. They became inaccessible by design. This transformation reshaped belief without naming itself as change. Myths adjusted tone. What had once been remembered as interaction became framed as legend. Human traits were softened into symbolism. Conflicts between gods and people were recast as moral lessons rather than events. Immortality replaced lineage. Timelessness replaced presence. Each shift increased stability while reducing immediacy. The brilliance of this restructuring was its subtlety. Nothing was denied. Everything was elevated. By moving divine figures beyond reach, societies created a past that could be revered without being relived. The sacred became safe. It inspired without interrupting. It commanded respect without demanding response. Order thrived in the absence of challenge. This distance also protected memory from contradiction. When gods lived among people, stories varied. Experience differs depending on where one stands. By relocating the sacred to an unreachable era, narratives could be unified, disagreement softened, the past settled, certainty replaced complexity. The unsettling realization emerges slowly. Myth here is not imagination, but architecture. It restructures memory to support stability. What once overlapped is divided carefully, not erased. The divine world becomes vertical, distant, and silent. The human world becomes horizontal, governed, and manageable. Between them forms a boundary that feels natural only because it is repeated. This shift answered a growing need. Large societies cannot function amid constant sacred interruption. Predictability becomes survival. Distance becomes peace. Over time, people forget that closeness ever existed. The new arrangement feels eternal. Gods have always been above. Humans have always been below. Yet the memory of overlap does not disappear entirely. It lingers as unease, as reverence mixed with fear, as stories that feel too intimate for pure fantasy. These remnants are allowed to remain because they no longer threaten structure. They are framed as metaphor rather than memory. The gods, now relocated, become symbols of order rather than participants in life. Their absence is explained through narrative rather than admission. Humans are told the age of closeness ended long ago, that it must have ended, that such proximity belongs to a world less disciplined, less refined. And so, the separation holds. It feels logical, necessary, invisible. What was once shared reality is now carefully divided, safely contained within story. The question no longer becomes whether gods walked among humans, but why they stopped. That question itself is redirected, softened, made distant. It points upward instead of inward. Once the gods are unreachable, their silence requires explanation. And in providing that explanation, humanity steps further into a new role. The next transformation begins not with belief, but with justification, with the need to explain absence without acknowledging rearrangement, with stories designed not to recall closeness, but to normalize distance. As distance grew between humans and the sacred, memory required a new form of shelter. Direct remembrance was no longer sustainable, too vivid, too disruptive, too capable of reopening questions that fragile societies could not afford to face again. Myth emerged not as fantasy, but as containment. It allowed the past to survive without remaining active. Stories softened what once carried force. Sharp events were rounded into patterns. Trauma was wrapped in repetition until it lost its ability to wound. When a story is told often enough, its power changes. Shock dissolves into familiarity. Awe becomes tradition. What once demanded response becomes something observed from a safe distance. In this way, myth protected both people and memory. It preserved meaning while removing urgency. Gods became larger than life, not to elevate them, but to push them further away. Exaggeration created space. Immortality erased timelines. Impossible feats replaced uncomfortable realism. The more distant the figures became, the less threatening their closeness felt. Human-like interactions were gradually transformed. Conflict became moral lesson. Instruction became allegory. Events that once altered the course of communities were reframed as eternal struggles happening outside ordinary time. This shift dulled emotional weight. What could no longer be relived could still be remembered without destabilizing the present. Repetition played a crucial role. Telling the same story again and again does not only preserve it, it changes it. Details flatten, emotion settles. The story becomes predictable, and predictability breeds safety. What once unsettled listeners now soothed them. Myth lulled memory into calm. This is where the deeper realization takes shape. Myth may not be history distorted by imagination. It may be history rendered harmless, a controlled echo of something once overwhelming. By encoding memory into story, societies ensured survival not only of the past, but of the present. Nothing about this process required deception. It unfolded naturally, guided by human need for stability. Dangerous memory does not vanish. It waits. It reshapes itself into forms acceptable to the moment. Myth became a vessel strong enough to carry truth while preventing it from spilling. Yet containment is never perfect. Over time, fragments leak, inconsistencies linger. Certain stories feel heavier than others, carrying an unease that resists simplification. Symbols appear that seem too specific, too persistent, too familiar across distant cultures. These are not accidents. They are stress points where memory presses against its container. By the end of this transformation, humanity gained something invaluable: continuity. The past was no longer capable of tearing the present apart, but the cost was subtle. Context faded. Closeness vanished. Meaning survived, stripped of its original environment. Myth settled into its role quietly. It no longer challenged order. It supported it. It offered identity, structure, and comfort. Yet beneath its calm surface, something remained intact, compressed, waiting, not erased, not destroyed, simply buried beneath layers of story. And this is where the search must continue. Because containers crack, they age. Pressure builds slowly, invisibly. As time moves forward, the same forces that once demanded containment begin pressing outward again. The next stage of this story does not ask what myths mean, but where they fail. It turns attention toward the fissures, the unexpected places where the overlap between past and present still breathes. There comes a moment when coincidence begins to feel thin. It happens quietly, without announcement, when the same shapes appear too often to ignore. Across distant continents and forgotten ages, stories rise that seem to recognize one another. Floods arrive without invitation and erase the world clean. Beings descend from above, carrying knowledge that feels complete rather than discovered. Humanity remembers a time of greater closeness, longer life, deeper understanding, followed by a sudden fall into limitation. These stories do not wander randomly. They move with structure. A world begins in balance. An intervention follows. Knowledge is granted or revealed. Something is broken. A cleansing arrives. Survivors rebuild beneath a sky that no longer feels as near. This sequence repeats with unsettling precision, even in cultures separated by oceans, climates, and language. The details change, but the bones remain. The narration does not rush to explain this. Explanation arrives too quickly and comforts too easily. Instead, attention is asked for patience. Pattern carries weight. When a single story appears twice, it invites curiosity. When it appears hundreds of times, it invites unease. Creativity alone begins to feel insufficient. These civilizations had no shared maps, no known contact, no reason to borrow from one another. Yet, they remembered the same roles: sky teachers, deluges, ancestors who were not fully human. A golden age that ended abruptly, not gently. This is not merely shared symbolism, it is shared sequencing, shared memory behavior. The mind searches for answers it already understands. Fear of nature, the universality of water, human imagination reaching upward. These explanations linger briefly, then weaken. They fail to explain consistency across such vast separation. They explain themes, but not order. They explain ideas, but not memory patterns. Repetition begins to ask a different question. Not how these stories formed, but why they remained so similar. Why certain details refused to fade while others vanished. Why floods erase rather than punish. Why teachers arrive before collapse, not after. Why humanity remembers loss more clearly than arrival. At a certain density, similarity stops feeling like invention and starts behaving like recall. Memory does not need to be perfect to be persistent. It survives in fragments, carried imperfectly across time, reshaped by culture, but anchored by experience. What returns again and again may be what once mattered most. In this light, global myth begins to feel less like independent creativity and more like echo. An echo does not repeat sound exactly. It distorts, stretches, and fades. Yet its source remains identifiable. The further it travels, the stranger it sounds. Still, it carries direction. Still, it points backward. These stories do not claim to be history. They do not ask to be believed. They simply remain, quietly persistent, embedded in ritual, song, and origin. Their survival does not depend on accuracy, only resonance. They feel familiar even when encountered for the first time. They settle easily into the mind, as if remembered rather than learned. This familiarity unsettles because it suggests shared inheritance rather than shared imagination. Something once experienced may have scattered outward as cultures separated, leaving impressions rather than records. Each civilization held a piece, unaware it was incomplete, each remembered from a different angle. The discomfort deepens when one realizes that forgetting behaves differently. Independent invention diverges rapidly. Memory converges slowly. What is forgotten fragments, what is remembered aligns. The persistence of these stories suggests not creativity blooming everywhere at once, but remembrance struggling to survive everywhere at once. The repetition does not answer anything directly. It only sharpens focus. When the same story appears everywhere, the important question is no longer whether it is true, but what it is pointing toward. An echo demands a source, and once the echo is heard clearly enough, attention can no longer remain with the sound alone. It must turn toward the place it came from, toward whatever stood at the center before memory scattered into story. The figures described as gods across ancient traditions carry a strange familiarity. They do not move like distant forces or silent principles. They speak, argue, and demand. They reward loyalty and punish defiance. They take sides in conflicts that feel personal rather than cosmic. Their emotions are recognizable. Their reactions feel measured, strategic, sometimes insecure. This familiarity creates quiet tension because it blurs a boundary we assume should be clear. These gods form families, inherit rivalries, and defend status. They rule territories, establish laws, and expect obedience. They worry about being remembered, praised, and honored correctly. They show jealousy when attention shifts elsewhere. Across cultures, this behavior repeats with unsettling consistency. The divine does not behave like abstraction. It behaves like authority. It is tempting to explain this as projection, to say humans created gods in their own image. Yet this explanation does not fully settle the unease. If imagination were the source, why would the imagined beings replicate the same hierarchies humans already lived under? Why imagine gods who demand taxes in the form of offerings, enforce rules, and punish dissent? Imagination often exaggerates freedom. These stories exaggerate control. A quieter possibility emerges. What if these figures were not invented as gods, but remembered as leaders? Kings, lawgivers, ancestors, or rulers whose influence once extended far beyond ordinary reach. Over time, memory could elevate them without changing their behavior. Authority remembered grows larger, not different. Distance adds power, not purity. In many traditions, gods do not arrive as eternal beings. They appear suddenly, already established, already commanding. Their rule is accepted, not explained. This mirrors how leadership is inherited rather than chosen. Power feels ancient because it is older than the individual encountering it. Reverence forms naturally around those who shape survival. The boundary between god, king, and ancestor softens further when lineage is considered. Many divine figures trace family lines that resemble dynasties. They inherit roles, feud across generations, and enforce succession. These are not the concerns of abstract forces, they are the concerns of governance. Punishment, too, follows familiar patterns. Disobedience is met with withdrawal of protection, disaster, or exile. The language of justice feels administrative rather than mystical. Obedience maintains order. Defiance invites collapse. These stories describe systems, not miracles. The fear of being forgotten appears often. Gods demand remembrance through ritual and name. This fear suggests dependence on acknowledgement rather than timeless existence. Something that truly exists beyond time does not require validation. Something rooted in legacy does. Divinity, seen through this lens, may have been assigned after the fact. Power remembered becomes power elevated. Leaders remembered become beings explained. The sacred may not have descended into the human world. It may have risen out of it. This idea does not deny mystery. It deepens it. If gods were once closer to human forms, their transformation into divine figures was not loss, but repositioning. Memory adjusted scale while preserving behavior. The result feels both familiar and unreachable. The stories never announce this shift. They hide it in reverence. They protect it through distance. Yet the human qualities remain visible, like fingerprints left behind. Authority echoes itself even after names change. If gods once ruled as something closer to humans, their traces should extend beyond story. Power shapes environment, leadership leaves marks. Memory alone does not build structures or organize space. The implication grows quietly, preparing attention to move away from narrative alone and toward what still stands, waiting to be noticed. Stone remembers differently than words. It does not drift, soften, or reinterpret itself with time. When the narration descends into ancient ruins, a different kind of unease appears. Precision lingers where it should not. Scale overwhelms where simplicity is expected. These structures do not feel like experiments. They feel like conclusions. Foundational monuments rise suddenly in the historical record, already confident in form. They are aligned with stars, seasons, and landscapes with an accuracy that suggests prior understanding. There is no visible hesitation in their design, no clear lineage of mistakes leading toward mastery. They appear complete, as if built by hands that already knew what worked. The question is not how stones were moved. That question distracts. The deeper unease comes from coordination. Massive projects require shared measurement, consistent planning, and long-term intention. They require systems. Yet many of these constructions predate written mathematics, formal engineering, or centralized states. Something guided their design before theory caught up. Walking through these remains produces a quiet shock. The proportions feel intentional. The angles feel informed. Nothing appears random or crude. These builders understood load, balance, and alignment well enough to leave work that endured longer than the cultures that raised it. Survival alone does not explain this confidence. Traditional timelines suggest gradual development, yet these sites do not display gradualness. They feel inserted rather than evolved. Civilization seems to arrive already fluent. This contradiction is rarely addressed directly. It is softened by gaps, exceptions, and cautious language that suggests anomaly rather than pattern. But repetition reappears. Across regions, monumental architecture emerges fully formed, then simplifies over time. Later generations repair, imitate, and diminish what they inherited. Complexity moves backward instead of forward. The first works remain the most precise. This observation does not demand answers. It asks patience. Perhaps knowledge was not invented in these moments, but remembered. Perhaps builders followed instructions whose origins lay beyond their own era. Replication requires less experimentation than discovery. Inheritance explains confidence without assuming impossibility. Stone preserves intent even when explanation disappears. It holds alignment long after stories fade. These structures become physical memory, standing quietly while interpretations shift around them. They do not argue. They simply remain. Archaeology often speaks softly around these places, careful not to disrupt balance. Questions are narrowed until they fit accepted frames. Language becomes cautious, layered with uncertainty. This carefulness protects credibility, yet it also limits curiosity. When certainty is required, ambiguity is treated as weakness. Yet these ruins resist final explanation. They sit outside comfort, demanding humility rather than conclusion. They do not shout forbidden truth. They whisper persistence, reminding observers that knowledge can survive its owners and that progress is not the same as origin. Standing before these stones, time feels uneven. The past does not recede politely. It presses forward, collapsing distance. One senses that learning once arrived faster than forgetting, that builders may have worked from memory rather than invention. If so, the ruins are not mysteries left behind, but messages left unfinished. They suggest continuity broken rather than beginnings formed. And if continuity was broken once, it can be broken again, reshaping everything believed about where humanity started. This possibility is not accusation or conclusion. It is an invitation to remain uncertain, to allow stone to ask questions language cannot answer, and to accept that silence in the record may not signal absence, but erasure, patience, or forgetting to be noticed. With that thought, the narrative turns uneasy. If ruins suggest inheritance, then something existed before them capable of passing knowledge forward. And if that source vanished, Its absence may explain the silence that follows. The next question is unavoidable and dangerous in its simplicity. What happened to what came before? The end does not arrive gently in ancient memory. It arrives as interruption, a sentence cut short, a breath taken and never released. Across cultures that never met, there is a shared remembrance of a world that did not slowly fade, but stopped. The language shifts suddenly from balance to loss, from presence to absence. Floods rise without warning. Fire falls from the sky. Darkness settles where light once lived. Silence follows where voices were expected. These accounts do not linger on rebuilding. They pause on the moment of ending itself, as if unable to move past it. Something precious was interrupted, and the interruption mattered more than what came after. This is not how gradual decline is remembered. Slow change softens memory. Sudden loss scars it. What repeats is not merely destruction, but shock. The world was stable, then it was not. The sky behaved differently. The ground turned unreliable. Familiar rhythms broke. In story after story, humanity survives, but altered, smaller, heavier, less certain. Survival is not celebrated, it is endured. These are not disaster stories in the modern sense. They read like punctuation marks placed inside memory, a full stop where continuity once existed. Cultures describe the same sensations even when details differ. Fear without cause, noise followed by stillness, light swallowed by shadow. The tone is mournful, restrained, reverent. Whatever ended was not simply a place, it was a way of living. Grief lingers inside these myths, though it rarely names itself. Loss becomes ritual, warning becomes symbol, memory becomes repetition. These stories are told not to frighten, but to remember what cannot be touched again. Myth carries emotion when explanation would fail. What is striking is not the imagery, but the consistency of feeling. Cultures separated by vast distance mourn something they claim no memory of witnessing, an ending remembered without witnesses, a trauma inherited rather than experienced. This suggests that grief itself traveled forward, passed down through tone, rhythm, and emphasis. The repetition of endings suggests that something important was lost quickly enough to require preservation through story, not because details mattered, but because the loss itself needed to remain present. Forgetting would be a second erasure. Myth becomes a vessel for mourning, holding space for something unnamed. This mourning shapes everything that follows. Humanity does not simply move forward, it carries the imprint of collapse in its caution, its reverence, its fear of excess. The golden age always lies behind. Progress is framed as recovery, rather than ascent. The past becomes larger than the future. Importantly, these stories do not explain why collapse happened. Explanation is absent. What remains is impact. This absence is telling. It suggests that the cause was either unknown, unbearable, or deliberately unspoken. Silence sometimes protects more than words. Across generations, collapse becomes symbolic, but the emotion does not fade. Storytelling preserves not the event itself, but the weight of it. This weight moves invisibly through culture, shaping values and boundaries. Do not anger the sky, do not disrupt balance, do not forget what happens when harmony breaks. The end of that age becomes the origin of caution. Law, ritual, and structure rise in its shadow. Order becomes a response to trauma. Distance from the sacred becomes safety. Control becomes memory's answer to chaos. What stands out most is this. Whatever ended mattered deeply. It mattered enough to be remembered everywhere, even when its shape blurred. It mattered enough to shape identity long after details were lost. Something of immense value was removed suddenly, leaving humanity changed rather than destroyed. This is why the stories do not feel like fantasy. They feel like aftermath. Like voices lowered when recalling something too painful to relive. They are not warnings of what might happen. They are remembrances of what already did. If collapse left such a deep imprint, then survival required adaptation, not only of shelter and food, but of memory itself. To live after such an ending, humanity had to change not just how it rebuilt, but how it remembered. And it is within that adaptation, that quiet reshaping of memory, that the next transformation begins, guiding the story forward into how survivors chose to carry the past without reopening the wound. Survival after collapse demanded more than rebuilding homes or finding food. It demanded restraint. The world that remained was fragile, shaped by loss and uncertainty. In such conditions, memory itself could become dangerous. To remember too clearly was to reopen wounds that had nearly erased everything. Knowledge, once a source of power, now carried risk. Silence, then, was not imposed. It was chosen. Survivors learned that not everything should be spoken directly. Not every truth carried whole. Some experiences were too heavy, too destabilizing for generations already struggling to stand. What had ended could not be undone by remembering it accurately. It could only be survived by remembering it carefully. So memory was reshaped. Knowledge was not destroyed, but divided. Broken into smaller pieces, safer to hold. Symbols replaced detail. Ritual replaced instruction. Story replaced explanation. In this way, truth could move forward without dragging its full weight behind it. This was not forgetting as failure. It was forgetting as defense, a way to ensure continuity without repetition. The sharpest lessons were dulled so they would not cut again. The most powerful knowledge was wrapped in ceremony, requiring time and maturity to approach. Meaning became layered rather than direct. Myth served this process well. It allowed memory to persist without remaining volatile. A flood could be remembered without recreating fear. A fallen age could be honored without inviting despair. What mattered was not precision, but direction. Do not repeat this. Do not cross this boundary. Do not forget that something once went terribly wrong. In this form, memory became stable. It could be inherited without overwhelming the inheritor. Each generation received guidance without context, lesson without blueprint. This protected society from repeating mistakes while preventing obsession with the past. The future required attention. The past needed containment. There is a quiet moral complexity in this choice. Something vital was preserved, but something was also surrendered. Full understanding was delayed, perhaps indefinitely. Survivors accepted that future generations might never know exactly what was lost. That loss was preferable to collapse repeating itself. Symbols carried more than they explained. A shape carved into stone. A story told only at certain times. A ritual performed without knowing why. These were not empty gestures. They were compressed memory, holding more than they revealed. Over time, explanation faded, but practice endured. This endurance mattered. Even when meaning thinned, structure remained. The symbol survived long after the memory that created it. It passed silently through centuries, waiting. Not forgotten, just unreadable. The idea that forgetting can be protective unsettles modern instincts. We are taught that knowledge saves, that clarity prevents repetition. Yet history suggests another truth. Some clarity destabilizes before it educates. Some knowledge arrives before a society can absorb it safely. Survivors understood this intuitively. They carried the past forward in a form that would not reignite the conditions of its destruction. Silence became part of preservation. Not an absence of memory, but a boundary around it. This boundary held for a long time. Long enough for civilizations to rebuild. Long enough for new identities to form. Long enough for the old world to feel impossibly distant. Yet containment is never permanent. Symbols degrade. Rituals lose explanation. Stories stretch and shift. What remains recognizable are fragments. Distorted, exaggerated, softened. Pieces of something larger that once fit together seamlessly. These fragments feel strangely heavy when encountered, as if carrying more meaning than their surface suggests. If memory was fragmented on purpose, then the past survives unevenly, not as a clear record, but as scattered clues. Some placed carefully, others lost, all waiting for attention. The original world does not announce itself. It hides within the distortion, requiring patience rather than certainty. This realization changes the direction of the search. The question is no longer what was forgotten, but where forgetting failed, where memory resisted containment, where symbols retained too much weight. Because if survivors reshaped memory to protect the future, then those reshaped forms may still point backward, quietly and imperfectly, toward what once was. By the time the collapse settled into silence, the past had not vanished. It had changed position. It no longer announced itself through presence or interruption. Instead, it folded quietly into the ordinary, disguising itself as routine, habit, and assumption. The overlap between gods and humans did not sink underground. It spread outward, dissolving into systems so familiar they escaped notice. Language became one of its hiding places. Certain words carried weight beyond their usage, echoing roles and relationships older than their definitions. Titles, names, and inherited phrases preserved hierarchies long after their origins faded. People spoke them daily without sensing the depth beneath the sound. Meaning survived, even when awareness did not. Time itself carried traces. Ancient calendars divided cycles in ways that felt arbitrary, but remained consistent across cultures. Certain days mattered more than others. Certain intervals repeated insistently. These patterns shaped ritual, agriculture, governance, and belief, yet rarely invited question. They worked, so they endured. Like fossils, their form remained even after the living structure that created them disappeared. Law followed a similar path. Some rules felt older than reason, accepted because they had always been there. Inherited boundaries, taboos, and moral structures guided behavior without explanation. These were not merely social agreements. They carried the imprint of earlier necessities, shaped by conditions no longer visible. Civilization continued to orbit decisions made in response to a world it no longer remembered. Symbols persisted everywhere. Numbers repeated with suspicious importance. Shapes returned across architecture, art, and ceremony. Certain arrangements felt correct in ways difficult to justify. These symbols no forcing belief. They simply remained, passed along because they were familiar, because they felt necessary, because removing them felt wrong. This is how the past learned to hide. Not through secrecy, but through normalization. When something becomes ordinary, it stops being examined. What once carried urgent meaning becomes background. What once guided survival becomes tradition. Over time, the extraordinary becomes invisible. The unsettling realization emerges slowly. Modern civilization may still be moving within frameworks established before history officially began. The foundations of order, authority, and meaning may not belong to recorded time at all. They may be inherited from an earlier arrangement, one reshaped but never fully erased. This does not announce itself as revelation. It settles as unease. The sense that something familiar is older than it appears, that systems function without fully explaining themselves. That answers feel incomplete, not because they are wrong, but because they are partial. The past is no longer distant in this view. It is present, subtle, and overlooked. It operates through repetition rather than memory, through assumption rather than awareness. It does not demand belief, it simply persists. This persistence sharpens the mystery rather than resolving it. If remnants of the overlap remain embedded in everyday life, then forgetting was never total. Containment softened memory, but it did not dissolve it. Pieces endured because they were useful, because they held things together. What matters now is not proving the past, but recognizing its proximity. Not uncovering buried ruins, but noticing inherited structures still shaping thought and behavior. The overlap did not vanish. It adapted. This chapter ends without answer because none can be given yet. Instead, it offers an invitation to look at what feels ancient but unquestioned, to notice repetition where explanation is absent, to feel the weight of continuity hiding inside familiarity. With these fragments identified, attention naturally shifts. If remnants survived openly, then someone, somewhere, decided how they would be carried forward. Access was shaped, meaning was filtered. The next movement of this story begins not with the past itself, but with those who stood between memory and humanity, determining what could be known and what must remain quietly in plain sight. After the collapse, memory did not disappear evenly. It fractured. Most people rebuilt with what remained light enough to carry, stories softened for survival, lessons reduced to custom. But a smaller number carried more. Not everything, never everything, but enough to feel the weight of what had been lost. These were not rulers or gods. They were intermediaries, standing quietly between what once was and what could safely continue. They did not call themselves guardians of history. They rarely spoke openly about the past. Instead, they appeared as priests, elders, judges, advisors, timekeepers. Their authority did not come from force, but from proximity to pattern. They remembered cycles where others saw chance. They recognized symbols where others saw decoration. They understood inherited rules whose origins had long been forgotten. For them, memory was not comforting. It was heavy. To remember too clearly in a world still recovering from trauma was dangerous. Knowledge unsettles when it arrives without preparation. It disrupts cohesion. It invites questions that fragile societies cannot absorb. These individuals learned quickly that truth, when unfiltered, could do more harm than ignorance. So they chose management over revelation. Their role was not to explain the past, but to contain its influence. They guided behavior without naming reasons. They preserved structure without exposing origin. In doing so, they became quiet regulators of memory's reach. This choice created tension. Remembering brought responsibility, but also isolation. Carrying fragments of a greater picture meant living among those who could not see it. Silence became protection, not deception. Knowledge was guarded not for power, but for balance. Over time, this uneven distribution hardened. Those who remembered more developed rules, boundaries, and methods of transmission. Access became controlled, gradual, conditional. Memory moved only where stability allowed it. What began as instinct became structure. Secrecy, in this light, was not corruption. It was adaptation, a way to prevent collapse from repeating itself. Yet every adaptation carries consequence. As generations passed, the reasons for silence faded, but the silence remained. What was once protective slowly became tradition. These keepers shaped culture without appearing to rule it. They influenced calendars, rituals, and law. They advised leaders while remaining unseen. Their presence stabilized societies, yet also filtered what could be known. The past narrowed, not because it vanished, but because access became selective. This filtering shaped human history deeply. Most people lived within simplified narratives, unaware of what had been withheld. Meanwhile, a smaller circle carried weight they could not fully release. Truth became a liability when misunderstood, so restraint felt necessary. The emotional cost of this restraint lingered. To remember too much meant accepting that others could not. It meant choosing silence, even when clarity might comfort. It meant watching stories flatten and symbols drift, knowing what they once held. Yet without this restraint, survival itself may have failed. These intermediaries did not see themselves as gatekeepers of power. They saw themselves as buffers between memory and collapse. Their quiet labor preserved continuity at the cost of transparency. This is where structure begins to take shape. Once memory is unevenly held, systems arise to regulate flow. Who may know, when, how much, and why. The next transformation grows naturally from this imbalance, as boundaries harden and rules emerge, determining how knowledge moves and how far it is allowed to travel. As memory concentrated, it demanded structure. Knowledge could no longer move freely without consequence. Boundaries formed quietly, not as walls, but as processes. Access was not denied outright. It was slowed, measured, shaped. What emerged looked spiritual on the surface, yet functioned as security beneath it. Initiation became a method of pacing. Silence became a test. Understanding arrived in layers, never all at once. Sacred languages limited who could participate fully. Symbols multiplied meanings rather than clarifying them. None of this existed to confuse. It existed to protect. Complexity itself became a filter, allowing powerful ideas to survive without being misused. To move closer to knowledge required patience. Submission was not demanded for obedience, but for readiness. Those who advanced were observed carefully, not for belief, but for restraint. Knowledge without control had already proven dangerous. Memory had nearly ended the world once. It would not be allowed to do so again. These systems, remembering, shaped culture deeply. People learned to trust guidance without explanation. Authority no longer needed force when interpretation could be controlled. If meaning could be framed, behavior would follow. What people believed mattered less than how they understood it. Over time, protection became hierarchy. What began as necessary, caution hardened into status. Those closest to the inner meanings gained influence naturally. Those further away accepted distance as order. The structure justified itself through stability. Things worked. Societies endured. The cost remained invisible. Meaning, once shared through experience, now moved through permission. Truth arrived gradually, symbol by symbol, lesson by lesson. This slowed distortion, but also concentrated power. Control over interpretation shaped reality more effectively than command ever could. The unsettling realization emerges softly. Force reshapes behavior temporarily. Meaning reshapes it permanently. Whoever controls how stories are understood, controls how the world is experienced. This control did not feel oppressive. It felt normal. It felt ancient. It felt correct. Because it was inherited, not imposed. Sacred knowledge was not hidden in darkness. It was placed behind effort. The effort itself ensured respect. Those who reached understanding did so changed by the journey. Those who did not trusted those who had. This trust became the foundation of order. As generations passed, the original reasons for filtering blurred. The structures remained. Symbols accumulated, layers no longer needed. Rituals persisted without explanation. The systems continued working even as their origins disappeared. Knowledge itself began to adapt to these boundaries. What could not be remembered safely was softened. What risked destabilization was reframed. Memory adjusted to fit its container. The past grew less precise, but more durable. This reshaping was not deception. It was survival extended over time. Yet each adjustment moved memory further from its source. Understanding thinned, while authority thickened. Meaning became inherited rather than discovered. By the time writing captured these systems, they already felt eternal. Their design was invisible because it had always been there. Control no longer required intention. It was embedded. As access narrowed, knowledge lost sharpness, but gained longevity. Dangerous clarity dissolved into manageable ambiguity. What remained felt sacred, unquestionable, beyond ordinary reach. This quiet evolution prepares the next shift. When memory is filtered long enough, it changes form entirely. Knowledge adapts to safety. Truth bends toward survival. And in that bending, something essential transforms, carrying the past forward in shapes that feel stable, yet increasingly distant from what was first remembered. When wisdom no longer needed to explain itself, it learned to repeat. Practical understanding faded not through collapse, but through time. Actions once tied to survival slowly detached from their reasons. Movements that had guided seasons and labor became gestures performed because they were familiar. Instructions that once protected life softened into prayers spoken without urgency. Nothing was lost in a single moment. Meaning thinned gradually, the way a river spreads as it approaches the sea. Each generation removed a little context, trusting repetition to carry what explanation no longer could. The act endured, even when the purpose blurred. Habit proved more resilient than understanding. Ceremony became the vessel. Events once linked to specific dangers or decisions were reenacted as tradition. The calendar turned, the ritual returned, and no one remembered why it had been necessary the first time. What mattered was that it had always been done. Continuity replaced comprehension. Symbols multiplied as explanation faded. A shape, a color, a number retained importance without revealing reason. These elements worked because they felt right, not because they were understood. They created belonging, reassurance, and rhythm. Societies moved in time with them, even as their origins disappeared beyond reach. This transformation carried a quiet sorrow. What remained looked intact, yet something essential had slipped away. The difference between performing an act and understanding it widened slowly, unnoticed. Wisdom did not vanish. It condensed. It became lighter, easier to carry, but less precise. Ritual preserved memory without preserving clarity. It offered stability in exchange for depth. Over time, this trade felt acceptable, even beneficial. Knowing less meant questioning less. Life felt smoother when it followed patterns without demanding reasons. Modern traditions inherit the shells of this process. Movements repeated in silence, words spoken without context, ceremonies honored without knowing what they once protected against. These practices feel ancient because they are, yet their urgency no longer survives. They calm rather than instruct. There is no villain in this erosion. Time itself performs the work. Each generation does what it must to survive its moment. What seems essential now will one day feel symbolic. This is not betrayal, but drift. Yet something changes when wisdom becomes habit. Habit does not question itself. It invites obedience through comfort rather than understanding. When symbols lose explanation, they become vulnerable to interpretation by those who supply meaning afterward. This is where melancholy deepens. What once guided behavior through necessity now guides it through repetition. The difference is subtle but powerful. Without context, ritual can be redirected. Symbol can be repurposed. What endures longest can be shaped most easily. The listener is left with a quiet realization. Much of what feels timeless may be residue, not instruction, echo rather than voice. And as this recognition settles, another possibility emerges. Once wisdom is reduced to ceremony, it can be organized, adjusted, and eventually used. The next step does not erase ritual. It learns to speak through it. This moment is not announced with alarm, only with quiet tension. The structures that survived forgetting now stand ready for interpretation. Whoever names the meaning of ritual shapes behavior without resistance. Habit obeys gently. Tradition listens. And so the groundwork is laid, not for revelation, but for influence that feels ancient, justified, and unquestioned. The story moves forward with this awareness, toward those who learn not only to preserve ritual, but to steer it, deciding which meanings remain visible and which stay hidden beneath familiarity. This conclusion prepares the path ahead, where control emerges, softly and deliberately, using ceremony as its language and silence as its shield for generations to come. At first, history was only a vessel. It carried memory forward, preserving what could no longer be lived directly. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, its role changed. The act of recording stopped being passive. It became intentional. Stories were no longer received exactly as they arrived. They were adjusted, framed, and arranged to serve the needs of the present. This shift did not require deception. It required emphasis. Certain details were repeated until they felt central. Others were mentioned less often, then not at all. Timelines stretched, where clarity threatened cohesion. Events were grouped, simplified, or separated to form a shape that felt orderly. Over generations, these small adjustments accumulated. Meaning shifted without anyone needing to announce it. History learned to justify. As societies grew more complex, they needed explanations that supported authority, identity, and continuity. The past offered legitimacy when shaped carefully. Decisions felt stronger when rooted in tradition. Power felt stable when framed as inheritance. Memory became useful when it aligned with structure. This process followed instinct rather than conspiracy. Humans naturally reshape memory to reduce tension. A story that supports the present is easier to live with than one that challenges it. Over time, shared memory turned selective. What reinforced stability was preserved, what raised questions was softened, what could not be reconciled was reframed. The unsettling realization emerges quietly. History does not need to be erased to be controlled. It only needs to be curated. Selection determines emphasis. Emphasis determines meaning. Meaning determines behavior. Control enters not through force, but through narrative. Written records played a crucial role in this transition. Once history was fixed in text, it gained authority. Yet texts themselves were not immune to adjustment. New copies appeared with subtle changes. Interpretations were added. Context shifted. The story remained familiar enough to feel unchanged, yet different enough to guide thought in new directions. This is how alteration hides, not as contradiction, but as continuity. A past that looks consistent feels trustworthy. Few stop to ask what has been excluded. Fewer still notice what no longer appears. No single group needs to be blamed for this transformation. It is woven into how memory and power interact. Stability depends on coherence. Coherence depends on narrative. Narrative depends on choice. Over time, these choices form tradition, and tradition resists questioning. What was once a shared inheritance becomes an edited archive. The past narrows, complexity thins. Contradictions are resolved not through understanding, but omission. History grows smoother, easier to teach, easier to defend. Truth survives in this process. but not unchanged. It survives by being useful. Facts that support identity endure. Those that threaten it fade. Accuracy matters less than cohesion. Meaning becomes more valuable than detail. This does not make history false. It makes it shaped. A mirror adjusted to flatter the present. Each generation polishes it further, rarely noticing the gradual transformation. What feels ancient may be relatively new. What feels unquestionable may have been decided quietly. As myth once softened memory to protect survival, history now reshapes memory to protect order. The boundary between them blurs again, but this time deliberately. Story and record exchange roles. Myth gains structure, history gains symbolism. Both guide behavior without announcing their influence. This is the moment when the past becomes a tool, not wielded aggressively, but held gently, used to steady movement forward. The cost of this steadiness is subtle. It is the loss of perspective. When history serves need before truth, it teaches people who they are allowed to be, and what they are discouraged from asking. From here on, memory is no longer only inherited. It is managed, and once management becomes normal, the past no longer belongs equally to everyone. It belongs to those who decide how it is told, how it is framed, and which meanings are allowed to remain visible as history continues its quiet transformation into narrative, authority, and justification. When the gods were no longer allowed to walk freely through human life, they did not vanish. They were translated. Their presence was converted into lesson. Their actions softened into meaning. What once happened became what was meant. This change did not arrive through philosophy or discovery. It arrived through need. Stories that described gods arguing, ruling, and intervening carried too much potential. If taken literally, they challenged authority. They suggested that power could appear unexpectedly, that rules might be interrupted, that legitimacy might be questioned. This was unstable. Recasting gods as allegory solved the problem without destroying reverence. A god as metaphor cannot disobey expectation. A god as principle cannot contradict doctrine. Once divine figures became symbols of virtue, order, or natural law, their actions no longer described events. They illustrated values. Meaning replaced presence, interpretation replaced encounter. This shift felt gentle because it preserved language. The names remained, the stories were told again. Yet something essential changed beneath repetition. Actions once remembered as things that happened were now explained as lessons to be understood. The divine world became instructional rather than interactive. This transformation was strategic, though not always conscious. Abstracted gods no longer disrupted the present. They belonged safely to story and ritual. They could be invoked without risk, interpreted without consequence. Their distance ensured compliance. Reverence no longer carried uncertainty. Importantly, this was not enlightenment dissolving belief. It was control dissolving ambiguity. Myth was not stripped away, it was repurposed. Stories remained powerful, but their power shifted direction. They now guided behavior instead of challenging it. A god, explained, loses agency. Once actions are symbolic, they no longer demand response. They can be admired, debated, or dismissed, but they cannot intervene. This made divine narratives compatible with expanding institutions. Authority could function without interruption. Over time, listeners learned to hear these stories differently. What once felt immediate now felt instructional. Questioning faded, because questioning symbols feels unnecessary. Meaning was delivered complete, without invitation to revisit origin. This reframing also shaped identity. Humanity was placed at the center of moral development, not cosmic interaction. Gods became mirrors rather than participants. They reflected ideals rather than events. This positioned humans as learners instead of witnesses. The safety of this arrangement ensured its survival. Abstract meaning travels farther than lived memory. It fits neatly into teaching, governance, and tradition. It removes unpredictability while preserving awe. The divine became inspiring rather than disruptive. Yet something was lost quietly. When gods ceased to act within the world, humanity lost a point of reference. The past became sealed, unreachable, except through explanation. Questions about origin were redirected into ethics. Curiosity was absorbed into instruction. This is the major realization that settles slowly. Myth was not neutralized by reason alone. It was neutralized by reinterpretation. The sacred was made harmless by being made symbolic. The gods were not dismissed. They were disarmed. This allowed history and doctrine to stabilize. With no active divinity to interrupt narrative, the present could define itself freely. Order felt eternal. Authority felt justified. The divine past could be honored without being challenged. And as the gods became safely symbolic, attention shifted naturally. If divinity no longer acted directly, then humanity alone carried responsibility. The story narrowed, focusing inward. Limits were defined. Roles were assigned. The next question did not concern gods, but humans, and what boundaries were placed around their place in the unfolding story. Those boundaries would not be announced as restrictions, but as explanations. They would feel natural, even benevolent. Humanity would be taught where it belonged, what it could know, and what lay beyond its reach. In narrowing the divine, the human story was narrowed as well. Possibility shrank quietly, replaced by permission. And with that narrowing, a new form of order settled in, one that felt stable precisely because it no longer expected interruption from above. This shift did not feel like loss at the time. It felt like clarity. Yet beneath that clarity, a quiet emptiness formed, unnoticed until much later. Something had been moved out of reach, not destroyed, but carefully placed beyond questioning. And in that careful placement, the ground was prepared for defining humanity, not by what it remembered, but by what it was allowed to forget. This narrowing would shape every chapter that followed, drawing lines around identity, authority, and memory itself, until forgetting no longer felt imposed, but necessary. It was here that the human story accepted its limits, without realizing they had been written long before now. With the gods safely distant, a quieter transformation took place. Humanity did not simply inherit the story, it became the story's center. Attention shifted inward. The narrative tightened around human beginnings, struggles, and progress. This felt like elevation, but it carried a limit hidden inside praise. Humans were reframed as newcomers to existence. History now opened with us, not before us. The past was presented as a blank waiting to be filled by human effort. By feeling young, humanity felt unburdened. There was no obligation to search beyond records, no need to listen for older voices. Identity became smaller, simpler, and easier to govern. This reframing brought stability. If humans believed themselves early and incomplete, they would look forward instead of backward. Progress replaced inheritance. Innovation replaced remembrance. Questions about predecessors dissolved into curiosity about potential. The deeper past became unnecessary. The effect was subtle. Humanity did not lose importance. It gained focus. Everything revolved around human agency, human choice, human limits. The universe became a stage built recently, not a space shaped by forgotten participants. This focus strengthened control because it narrowed imagination. Stories adjusted accordingly. Origins were simplified. The world was described as awaiting human arrival. Earlier, complexity was folded into metaphor. Anything that suggested continuity beyond humanity felt disruptive and was softened or ignored. The center held because it was taught that nothing else belonged there. This reset of identity carried emotional comfort. Being young suggests innocence. It excuses ignorance. It justifies mistakes. It promises growth. In this framework, humanity did not need elders beyond itself. Guidance came from institutions rather than ancestors. Yet something uneasy remains beneath this comfort. To be young is to be incomplete. To lack inheritance is to lack depth. By accepting itself as a beginning, humanity quietly surrendered claims to older belonging. Questions that reached too far back were framed as fantasy. This is the deepest rewrite. Not the movement of gods, but the placement of humans. By narrowing identity, possibility was narrowed too. Memory outside the approved timeline became irrelevant. The disorientation arrives slowly. If humanity is not young, if it stands within a much longer continuum, then responsibilities change. Curiosity sharpens, limits blur, identity expands beyond permission. The chapter ends without resolution because certainty would restore comfort. Instead, it leaves imbalance, the sense that something essential has been misplaced. The realization that the story we tell about ourselves determines how far we are allowed to look. With the past reshaped and identity narrowed, attention turns forward uneasily. Fragments do not remain quiet forever. When they resurface, they do so without permission, unsettling narratives that depend on youth and isolation. What comes next is not discovery, but confrontation, as the center begins to feel unstable and the edges press inward, demanding to be seen again. That pressure marks a turning no story can soften. When buried continuity asserts itself, explanations falter. Familiar timelines strain. People feel unease before they find language. This discomfort is the signal, not the conclusion. It suggests that memory does not belong entirely to record, nor identity to permission. Something older presses gently, persistently, asking to be acknowledged without being named. The narrative pauses here, not to answer, but to prepare. Because once fragments begin resurfacing, they do not ask whether we are ready. They test the structures built to contain them. And in that testing, humanity will face a choice between defending a comfortable youth or risking maturity by listening again. What follows moves beyond history into consequence, where memory returns unpredictably, and the present must decide what it can bear without collapsing under familiar fear. For a long time, humanity has told itself a comforting story about progress. Each age imagines itself standing higher than the last, moving steadily forward, leaving confusion behind. Yet beneath this confidence lies an older rhythm, quieter and more unsettling. Not a straight line, but a loop. Rise, peak, collapse, silence, then beginning again. Ancient calendars do not speak in promises of endless ascent. They speak in returns. Ages turn, worlds renew. Golden eras are placed firmly in the past, never the present. Civilizations describe themselves as survivors, not pioneers. Again and again, people write as though they arrived late to something already diminished. This repetition deserves attention. It is not poetic flourish. It is memory behaving in pattern. When cultures mark time in cycles rather than destinations, they reveal an expectation shaped by experience. What rises will fall. What is built will be lost. What is known will thin. The idea of constant progress is young. It depends on forgetting earlier interruptions. Yet the older stories never forgot. They warned quietly. Knowledge has been lost before. Order has failed before. The present has followed greatness, not created it. These warnings are rarely emphasized. They sit embedded in ritual and timekeeping, visible but ignored. Most people live as though collapse belongs to myth, not repetition. But the calendars persist. The ages turn regardless of belief. This is not pessimism. It is observation refined by memory. If something has happened once, it carries the possibility of happening again. And if it has happened many times, it becomes rhythm rather than exception. The unsettling realization arrives slowly. Forgetting may not be failure. It may be function. When civilizations collapse, they reset. What survives is what can be remembered safely. Complexity thins. Knowledge scatters. The cycle begins again, lighter, simpler, less burdened by what came before. This pattern explains why each age believes itself unique, advanced, separate. Memory of previous peaks is too heavy to carry forward intact. Amnesia becomes adaptation. Forgetting allows rebuilding without paralysis. The cost of this survival strategy is repetition. When memory resets, mistakes are relearned. Achievements must be rediscovered. Progress feels new each time because context has vanished. Civilizations rarely recognize themselves as cycles. They prefer stories of origin and destiny. Cycles do not promise meaning. They promise return. Yet the evidence remains, etched into how time itself is measured. The discomfort grows when one notices how often rediscovery follows collapse. Knowledge appears suddenly, fully formed, then fades again. The same ideas surface across eras, always framed as new, always celebrated, always eventually forgotten. This suggests that history is not marching forward blindly, but circling carefully, shedding what it cannot safely retain. Survival favors repetition over accumulation. Memory resets, protects societies from the weight of their own past. The implication is psychological rather than mechanical. Humanity may forget not because it is careless, but because remembering everything would break continuity. Collapse enforces humility. Silence creates space. This does not remove responsibility. It reframes it. If cycles exist, then vigilance matters more than optimism. Progress without memory becomes fragile. Confidence becomes risk. The section closes without certainty, only a feeling. That humanity has stood here before. That knowledge has felt complete before. That collapse has surprised civilizations that believed themselves secure. The cycle does not announce its return. It waits. And if civilization truly resets, then rediscovery becomes dangerous. When fragments of earlier knowledge resurface, they arrive out of sequence, without warning. They bring the past too close to the present, threatening stability. What happens next depends not on whether history repeats, but on whether anyone recognizes the pattern before it closes again. Every cycle leaves behind fragments. Most remain buried, softened by time, forgotten before they can trouble the present. Yet occasionally, something surfaces too clearly. An idea appears without a lineage. A method arrives without preparation. Knowledge emerges that feels complete rather than experimental. These moments disturb more than they inspire. History records them quietly. Sudden advances without visible foundation. Insights that bypass expected stages. Figures whose understanding exceeds the boundaries of their age. They do not arrive loudly. Often they speak calmly, almost casually, unaware that what they carry does not belong to the moment that receives it. The response is rarely celebration. It is caution. Institutions pause. Communities hesitate. Questions arise not about whether the idea works, but about what it threatens. Stability depends on sequence. Knowledge that arrives without sequence feels dangerous, even when it is useful. Suppression does not always mean destruction. More often, it is dilution. An idea is reframed as curiosity rather than truth. Its edges are softened, its implications narrowed. It is absorbed into acceptable forms, stripped of what unsettles. Sometimes it is ridiculed. Sometimes it is praised and neutralized. Sometimes it is wrapped in myth and removed from serious consideration. Those who carry these rediscoveries rarely appear as villains or heroes. They are often isolated, misunderstood, or recast after their time. Their work survives, but rarely intact. The pattern repeats regardless of culture or era. What matters is not the individual, but the response. Rediscovery threatens because it reopens continuity too quickly. It brings the past closer than society is prepared to face. Systems built on selective memory depend on sequence to function. When knowledge skips steps, it destabilizes hierarchy and control. This reveals a deeper dynamic. Truth may not be denied outright. It may be delayed. Timing matters. An idea that would be accepted in one era becomes disruptive in another. Not because it is false, but because it arrives before structures exist to contain it. Silencing, in this context, is not always cruelty. It is often fear of collapse. Institutions remember what happens when knowledge outruns understanding. They respond by slowing, filtering, redirecting. This does not require intent. It is instinct shaped by memory of instability. Over time, society learns to recognize certain signals, ideas that promise too much clarity too quickly, discoveries that dissolve accepted limits, narratives that suggest continuity beyond approved history. These trigger resistance automatically, framed as skepticism, caution, or responsibility. The unsettling realization settles gradually. Some truths are not dangerous because they are wrong. They are dangerous because they arrive out of order. They bypass the filters that ensure stability. They awaken questions that cannot yet be answered safely. History remembers these moments as anomalies, lost technologies, forbidden ideas, geniuses ahead of their time. Yet the pattern suggests something else. Rediscovery is not rare, acceptance is. When societies are not ready, they protect themselves by reinforcing boundaries. They do not eliminate rediscovery. They redirect it. They fragment it. They postpone its impact until it can be absorbed without rupture. This process feels natural. It feels responsible. It feels necessary. Yet it ensures repetition. Knowledge resurfaces again and again, always framed as new, always resisted, always partially lost. The cycle tightens. The section does not accuse, it observes. It notices that rediscovery follows collapse like a shadow. that ideas buried for survival eventually push upward again, that each time they do, the response mirrors the last. What emerges is not conspiracy, but pattern. Civilization oscillates between forgetting and remembering, innovation and containment. Progress advances unevenly, constrained not by ignorance, but by readiness. This understanding reshapes how forbidden discoveries are viewed. They are not errors in the record. They are signals, indicators that the past has not finished speaking. That continuity presses forward regardless of permission. If rediscovery repeatedly destabilizes societies, then boundaries must be rebuilt, not once, but continually. Each age reinforces filters, strengthens interpretation, and reasserts sequence. Memory is managed again. The cycle prepares to repeat. The tension lingers quietly. Knowledge waits. Society adapts. And somewhere between suppression and survival, truth learns patience, appearing briefly, disappearing again, never fully gone, never fully allowed. Whenever fragments of the past rise too close to the present, a familiar response follows. It is not panic, and rarely force. It is organization. Systems adjust themselves quietly, reasserting boundaries that were never meant to disappear for long. The wall between what is allowed to be real and what must remain symbolic is rebuilt, layer by careful layer. Belief systems adapt first. Stories that once felt dangerously specific are reframed as metaphor. Accounts that suggest continuity are softened into coincidence. Language shifts subtly, guiding interpretation before questions can fully form. What cannot be denied outright is redirected, placed safely into categories that limit its reach. Institutions follow. Education emphasizes separation. Myth is taught as imagination. History is taught as linear. Anything that blurs the line is treated as curiosity rather than possibility. This is not deception, it is hygiene. Boundaries keep systems stable. Clear divisions prevent confusion. Skepticism becomes one of the most effective tools. It does not eliminate ideas, it contains them. By demanding proof according to narrow criteria, uncomfortable possibilities are held at a distance without needing to be disproven. They become unresolved rather than threatening. This restraint feels responsible, even protective. In this way, doubt serves order. It filters curiosity, allowing exploration only where it will not disrupt foundational assumptions. The past is permitted only in approved forms. Ruins are studied, but their implications are limited. Stories are collected, but their patterns are dismissed. Knowledge is explored, but only within safe frames. The gods remain symbolic. They must. If they regain agency, even as memory, authority would tremble. If the past becomes reachable again, present structures lose certainty. Distance ensures compliance. Silence ensures peace. This reinforcement is rarely announced. It feels like common sense. It feels like maturity. To question too deeply appears irresponsible. To connect too freely appears naive. Boundaries present themselves as wisdom rather than fear. Yet the wall is not solid stone. It is conceptual. It exists in curriculum, in language, in habit. It relies on repetition. Each generation inherits it without noticing its construction. What feels obvious has usually been installed long before questioning begins. This containment does not erase curiosity. It channels it. The mind is allowed to wander in controlled directions, to explore futures rather than origins, possibilities rather than continuities. The past remains safely unreachable, admired but inert. The sense of tightening comes slowly. Invisible restrictions settle into place. Certain questions lose traction. Certain connections feel inappropriate to pursue. Exploration continues, but within narrowed corridors. The wider landscape remains unseen. Importantly, no villain stands behind this wall. Defense emerges from memory of instability. Societies remember collapse without remembering details. They respond by keeping distance from whatever might reopen old wounds. Reinforcement feels like care. Yet walls serve both protection and separation. They keep danger out, but also truth in. What is lost is not knowledge itself, but freedom of association. Memory fragments remain, but they are prevented from forming larger patterns. By the end of this chapter, the wall stands firm again. Myth and reality are distinctly labelled. The past is sealed, the present feels orderly, but beneath that order, pressure accumulates quietly. Because walls do not remove what presses against them, they only delay contact. With the boundary reinforced, attention begins to turn inward. If the past cannot return openly, it may surface elsewhere. Not in ruins or records, but in instinct, in thought, in the subtle structures of perception itself. The next chapter does not search outward for evidence. It looks inward, toward the human mind, where no wall can ever be fully complete. When institutions reinforce boundaries and records fall silent, memory does not always disappear. Sometimes it relocates. The focus shifts now from texts and structures to something quieter and harder to trace the individual human mind. Not memory as recollection, but memory as instinct. The kind that does not announce itself as knowledge, only as familiarity. Across cultures, certain images recur with unsettling persistence. The same shapes feel significant. The same fears surface uninvited. The same stories stir something deep, even when heard for the first time. These patterns appear long before formal teaching, emerging in art, dreams, and intuition. They do not feel learned, they feel recognized. This recognition is often dismissed as coincidence or psychology, yet coincidence rarely carries emotional weight. These echoes do. Ancient myths feel strangely intimate, as though they are brushing against something already present. People respond to them not with surprise, but with a sense of knowing they cannot explain. Consider the experience of déjà vu. A moment arrives, ordinary and unremarkable, yet it feels remembered, not predicted, remembered. Logic fails to explain it fully, so it is set aside as anomaly. But anomalies repeating across humanity deserve attention. They suggest residue rather than randomness. Collective intuition works similarly. Entire communities respond instinctively to symbols they claim no direct memory of learning. Certain figures evoke trust or fear immediately. Certain patterns suggest danger without instruction. These reactions feel older than culture, older than language. If the overlap between gods and humans was once experiential, its collapse would not erase all traces. Experience leaves imprint, trauma imprints, wonder imprints. The body remembers what the mind cannot articulate. Instinct survives when explanation is lost. This does not require belief in inherited stories as facts. It requires acknowledging that human perception may be shaped by experiences far older than personal memory. The nervous system does not ask permission before responding. It reacts to pattern. Symbols that appear repeatedly in ancient myth still appear spontaneously in modern creativity. Not copied, but rediscovered. Archetypes emerge without blueprint. They feel universal because they are internal. This suggests a possibility more intimate than forgotten history. The past may not be something humanity studies from the outside. It may be something humanity carries within itself, shaped by experiences so old they bypass conscious recall. This idea remains careful, restrained. It does not claim certainty. It listens. It notices that people across cultures feel drawn to ancient stories not as entertainment but as echo. Something in them recognizes alignment. The familiarity unsettles because it resists instruction. It does not depend on education, belief, or agreement. It arrives spontaneously. It feels personal. It feels uninvited. If memory survives this way, it explains why certain ideas refuse to die, why the same myths reappear even when erased, why the past keeps pressing inward when blocked outward. The overlap may have left fingerprints on perception itself. This reframes forgetting. If knowledge cannot survive openly, it may persist implicitly, not as data, but as orientation, not as history, but as instinct. The loss of clarity does not imply total absence. It implies adaptation. The reveal here is quiet and personal. The past may not be something we learn, it may be something we recognize. Recognition does not need proof. It carries its own weight. This recognition invites introspection rather than argument. People do not need to be convinced of what they already feel. They need space to notice it without dismissal. If memory lives inside us, then the overlap between gods and humans was not only external, it shaped perception itself. It influenced how humans respond to mystery, authority, and the unknown. It may explain why questions older than history still feel urgent. The section ends softly. No conclusion is offered, only a shift. attention turns inward. If fragments of the ancient world persist within human awareness, then the boundary reinforced by institutions was never complete. Something slipped through, quietly, waiting not to be proven, but to be felt. Humans have always lifted their eyes toward the sky, even when the ground demanded attention. Long before telescopes or equations, people watched the movement above with expectation rather than curiosity. The stars were not distant objects. They were markers, witnesses, and guides. Looking up felt natural, almost instinctive, as though something important waited there to be noticed. This impulse survives unchanged. Children gaze upward without instruction. Civilizations separated by time and distance describe the sky as inhabited, ordered, watching. The language varies, but the direction does not. Humanity searches above not simply to explore, but to reconnect. Wonder carries familiarity. Ancient stories speak of beings who descended from the sky, taught, judged, departed. Modern narratives translate these figures into different forms, yet the posture remains the same. Eyes lift. Signals are sent outward. Silence is interpreted as distance rather than absence. Science did not redirect this impulse. It refined it. The tools changed, but the question endured. Exploration moved upward because the sky already held meaning. Curiosity followed memory, not the other way around. The search for origins instinctively points above, as if answers were always expected there. This expectation is emotional, not logical. It appears in hope during crisis, in prayers uttered without belief, in the sense of being observed when alone. Humans react to the sky as if relationship once existed. Loss feels implied. Orientation matters. Memory leaves direction when detail fades. Even when stories are stripped of agency, the gaze remains fixed. Humans do not look inward for permission. They look up. This inherited orientation explains persistence. No authority commands it, no institution enforces it. The impulse appears across belief systems, evolving yet unchanged. The sky retains gravity beyond physics. If the overlap once involved presence from above, its disappearance would not erase direction. Habit would remain. Expectation would survive without explanation. Longing would lose object, not movement. Modern exploration repeats this pattern unconsciously. Technology seeks what myth once described. Language changes to remain acceptable, but the emotional driver persists. The sky feels like origin, boundary, and return. Even disbelief does not cancel this response. Skeptics still look upward when questioning meaning. Acknowledgement is physical before it becomes intellectual. The body remembers orientation after belief dissolves. This suggests the overlap left something behind that cannot be archived or erased. It left a vector, a tendency, a sense that above once mattered more than empty space. The section closes without claim, only noticing. Humans keep searching the same direction because something within them expects alignment. Whether gods, ancestors, or watchers ever stood there becomes secondary to the persistence of the gaze itself. If this expectation lives inside perception, then the boundary separating past and present is not only historical, it is internal, woven into awareness, waiting quietly for recognition. Across history, moments of fear and wonder drive faces upward together. During disasters, people instinctively look to the sky for explanation, not to the earth beneath them. When hope thins, attention rises. This reflex bypasses reason. It does not wait for instruction. Even modern technology frames the sky as source. Satellites, signals, observation platforms all point outward. The highest ambition is still ascent. Language reveals this quietly. Progress is described as rising, failure as falling. Importance is elevated. Authority sits above. These metaphors persist because orientation persists. Such language is rarely questioned. It feels natural. Yet metaphors grow from habit, and habit grows from memory. The sky holds position in imagination long after belief fades. If humans were once oriented toward presence above, then looking up is not search but response. The body continues a conversation the mind has forgotten. Curiosity follows inherited posture. This does not demand belief in return. It demands attention to continuity. The impulse remains even when explanation disappears. Something ended, yet direction endured. The overlap may have withdrawn from sight, but not from influence. Orientation lingers as expectation without object. The sky becomes screen for projection because it was once site of encounter. This awareness unsettles gently. It asks whether exploration is discovery or remembrance, whether questions reach outward or backward, whether the future we seek is aligned with something older than history. If orientation survives, then the final boundary is not wall or record. It is perception itself, shaped by what it once faced. The gaze upward remains patient, persistent, and unexplained, reminding humanity that some directions are chosen long before language names them, and long after certainty fades, quietly guiding imagination toward absence that once felt full and still waits there now. Beneath every rewrite, every boundary, every careful explanation, one question remains untouched. It does not demand attention loudly. It waits. It surfaces gently, often unnoticed, disguised in new language, new frameworks, new curiosity. Were we alone in the beginning? This question has never belonged to one culture or one era. It changes clothing to survive. When gods walked among humans, it was asked through story. When gods were lifted away, it was asked through myth. When myth became allegory, it was asked through philosophy. When philosophy hardened into doctrine, it returned as science, speculation, and wonder. The words change, but the inquiry remains intact. Questions like this do not behave like facts. Facts are fragile. They depend on agreement, on context, on preservation. Questions endure because they resist closure. They do not require belief to survive. They only require curiosity. And curiosity, once planted, is difficult to erase. Every attempt to silence the question has only redirected it. When ancient stories were dismissed as superstition, the question slipped into astronomy. When belief lost authority, it resurfaced in mathematics and physics. When certainty demanded evidence, it adapted into hypothesis. The form shifted, but the pull remained. This persistence reveals something important. The question does not seek an answer as much as it seeks engagement. It refuses to settle because settlement would end movement. To answer it completely would freeze exploration. To remove it would remove direction. The question also carries emotional weight. It appears strongest during moments of uncertainty. When systems strain, when meaning thins, when identity feels unstable, people return to it instinctively. Not out of fear, but orientation. It offers scale. It reminds humanity that its story may not be the only one. This is why the question is never resolved by authority. Institutions can manage narratives, but they cannot extinguish wondering. They can redirect inquiry, but they cannot eliminate the need behind it. The question survives because it belongs to perception itself, not doctrine. Importantly, it does not accuse or demand revelation. It simply waits. It invites humility. It reminds humanity that certainty has limits, and that those limits may be important. Across centuries, the question resurfaces in quieter forms. Not as declaration, but as curiosity. Not as belief, but as wondering glance upward. It hides in art, speculation, dreams, and unanswered conversations. It remains present without explanation. This endurance suggests that something unfinished lies at the foundation of human memory. Not a missing answer, but an open space. A pause that was never meant to close. The narrative now slows deliberately. There is no urgency to resolve this question. Resolution would feel premature. Instead, it rests where it always has, beneath language, beneath record, beneath belief. It waits for readiness rather than proof. Readiness is the quiet shift happening now. The question has outlived suppression, reinterpretation, and dismissal. It continues to return because it is not about the past alone. It is about capacity, about whether humanity can hold uncertainty without collapsing into fear or control. As this chapter closes, the mystery changes shape. It is no longer investigative, it is contemplative. The question does not ask what happened. It asks what would it mean if the answer mattered now. And that is where attention must move next. Because unanswered questions do not weaken stories. They strengthen them. They ensure continuity. They keep memory alive without confining it. With the question still breathing quietly beneath everything, the final chapters approach carefully. They do not seek to answer it. They ask something more demanding. What if remembering changes what comes next? Something familiar is happening again, though it wears different language now. Ideas once buried under myth are returning, quietly, dressed as theory rather than belief. Where ancient stories spoke of watchers and creators, modern conversations speak of intelligence, simulation, and hidden influence. The words feel new, but the shape beneath them is old. Humanity has not stopped asking the same questions. It has only learned safer ways to ask them. In earlier ages, such thoughts were carried by gods, messengers, and heavens layered with intent. Now they appear as hypotheses, equations, and speculative models that promise no certainty. This shift is not a rejection of the past. It is a translation. Curiosity survives by adapting its voice to whatever language a culture permits. What was once framed as divine order is now framed as system. What was once called fate is now described as cycle. Creation narratives resurface as discussions about origin events, resets, or previous versions of reality. The emotional posture remains unchanged. Humanity still wonders whether it arrived alone, by accident, or as part of something larger already in motion. This continuity rarely feels threatening, because it avoids belief. The language of possibility offers distance. It allows exploration without commitment, wonder without surrender. By removing certainty, modern frameworks make ancient questions acceptable again. The divine becomes hypothetical, the sacred becomes abstract, and curiosity is allowed to reopen doors once sealed. There is comfort in believing these ideas are new. Novelty creates safety. If concepts appear unprecedented, they cannot challenge inherited identity. Yet their repetition tells another story. Each era believes it stands at the edge of revelation, unaware it is retracing older paths. Progress, in this sense, may not be movement forward, but gradual permission to approach what was once too close to hold. This pattern explains resistance without conspiracy. Ideas do not return fully formed because societies cannot accept them fully formed. They reappear, softened, reframed, renamed. Each generation edges closer to recognition by changing the terms of engagement. Memory resurfaces slowly enough to feel like discovery rather than return. The unsettling realization settles gently. Humanity may not be inventing new frameworks so much as remembering old ones in safer forms. Language evolves to protect stability while allowing curiosity to breathe. What returns is not belief, but permission. Permission to ask again, without risking collapse. Modern culture often celebrates disruption while quietly fearing its consequences. That tension explains why ancient questions now arrive through entertainment, speculation, and thought experiments. They are tested at a distance, explored without obligation. If rejected, nothing breaks. If accepted slowly, structures adapt. This process hides continuity in plain sight. The same questions cycle through different vocabularies, shedding imagery to survive acceptance. Gods become designers, angels become observers. Creation becomes initialization. None of this removes the underlying curiosity. It only changes how directly it is expressed. The sense of conflict between ancient belief and modern thought dissolves when continuity is recognized. What feels like opposition is evolution of tone, not direction. Curiosity survives by becoming acceptable, then familiar, then unquestioned again. This section does not argue for answers. It asks for patience with repetition. When ideas refuse to disappear, they deserve listening rather than dismissal. Their return suggests unfinished business, not error. If the same questions keep returning, perhaps the reason does not lie in imagination or coincidence, but in readiness. Humanity may circle ideas repeatedly, approaching them only when conditions allow. Each pass feels new because memory approaches from a different angle. This prepares the transition forward. If continuity persists beneath language, then resistance may reflect timing rather than truth. The question becomes not why ideas return, but when humanity becomes capable of holding them without fear. The story moves next toward readiness itself, toward the subtle signs that suggest change is no longer theoretical, but quietly underway. Something familiar waits just ahead, patient, unresolved, no longer willing to remain unseen entirely. Change rarely announces itself. It gathers quietly, like pressure beneath a surface that still looks solid. Cultures do not shift, because they are convinced. They shift because what once explained everything begins to strain, leaving gaps no story can comfortably fill. Across history, moments of rigid certainty have always preceded fracture. When frameworks tighten too much, they snap under their own weight. People sense this long before language catches up. Doubt spreads not as rebellion, but as exhaustion. This loosening is not collapse, it is adaptation. Certainty weakens when it no longer fits lived experience. Old stories begin to echo instead of answer. Questions that were once dangerous feel quietly acceptable again, not because they are solved, but because they can be held. As societies expand their view outward, they also turn inward. The universe grows vast. Humanity feels smaller, less certain of its place. In that humility, forgotten possibilities re-enter conversation. Not as belief, but as wonder. Wonder is allowed where certainty would fail. This shift does not signal destiny. It signals readiness. Cultures begin to tolerate uncertainty when the cost of denial becomes greater than the fear of questioning. Identity loosens, boundaries soften. What was once rejected outright is revisited carefully, without urgency. The unsettling realization emerges slowly. Humanity may avoid certain truths not because they are false, but because they destabilize who we believe ourselves to be. Some ideas threaten structure before they threaten accuracy. They ask for change, not agreement. When readiness increases, visibility follows. What was always present becomes noticeable. The overlap does not return through revelation. It returns through recognition. People notice connections they once dismissed. Familiarity replaces fear. This recognition is gentle. It does not demand belief or obedience. It asks only attention. Maturity here does not mean certainty. It means capacity to hold ambiguity without rushing to control it. Societies reach this state unevenly, briefly, then retreat again. Signs of preparation appear quietly. Language grows careful. Questions replace declarations. Interest shifts from answers to processes. Humanity becomes comfortable, admitting uncertainty, a skill it once resisted. This comfort is fragile, but meaningful. Remembering, in this sense, is not retrieval of data, it is integration. It alters identity by expanding context. That alteration can be destabilizing. It can also be liberating. Whether it heals or harms depends on timing. This is the quiet turning point. Readiness determines what becomes visible. Not everything resurfaces at once. Memory approaches gradually, testing stability before revealing depth. Recognition arrives only where collapse is unlikely. The overlap may never return dramatically. No sky opens, no voice descends. Instead, continuity seeps back through acceptance of uncertainty. What was once suppressed becomes discussable. The past breathes again, not as authority, but as possibility. This compassion matters. Framing this shift as destiny would reintroduce fear. Seeing it as growth allows patience. Humans change how they think before they change what they know. Readiness matures quietly. As frameworks loosen, remembering becomes possible without threat. Not full memory, not total recall, but enough to feel alignment, enough to sense continuity without dissolving identity. This balance defines readiness. The most important question now shifts. It is no longer what happened, but what remembering would do, how identity might stretch, what structures might need revision. The future responds to memory, not the other way around. This realization carries responsibility rather than revelation. To remember differently means to live differently. Readiness is measured not by curiosity, but by restraint, empathy, and the ability to change without collapsing into fear. Across cultures today, these capacities are being tested. Old certainties weaken. New questions emerge without clear answers. This does not signal confusion alone. It signals preparation, slow and uneven, unfolding beneath ordinary life. The calm tone of this moment matters. Panic would repeat old patterns. Control would harden walls again. Recognition asks gentler movement, allowing fragments to re-enter awareness without demanding immediate interpretation or belief. In this space, maturity replaces certainty as strength. The willingness to sit with unanswered questions becomes a cultural skill. Remembering, approach this way, feels less like disruption and more like quiet alignment. The narrative moves forward carefully from here. If readiness shapes what can be seen, then consequence replaces curiosity. The question ahead is no longer theoretical, but personal. What remembering would do now matters more than what it reveals. The future begins responding to recognition. Structures adjust, identity stretches, and humanity stands quietly at a threshold, shaped not by destiny, but by readiness. The moment lingers, unresolved, asking patience rather than answers. Before memory begins to surface again, something must be faced honestly. Forgetting did not happen by accident. It happened because knowledge, when held without wisdom, can fracture more than it heals. Civilizations learned this lesson slowly, painfully, and more than once. The overlap between gods and humans was not erased lightly. It left scars deep enough to shape culture for thousands of years. Whatever knowledge existed before collapse carried power, and power reshapes behavior long before it reshapes understanding. When certainty arrives without readiness, it does not bring peace. It brings division. Knowledge does not simply inform. It destabilizes. It questions authority. It disrupts identity. It forces change faster than societies can absorb. History shows that truth, introduced without context, can fracture belief systems that hold communities together. When shared meaning dissolves too quickly, cohesion collapses with it. This is why forgetting became protection. It slowed transmission. It softened clarity. It allowed time for rebuilding without reopening wounds that might never heal. Silence was not cowardice. It was restraint, learned through consequence. The danger is not truth itself. It is timing. Knowledge that arrives too soon bypasses reflection. It overwhelms rather than integrates. When certainty replaces humility, people act before they understand. History remembers what follows. The overlap was powerful enough to unsettle entire worlds. To uncover it carelessly would risk repeating the same patterns under different names. Collapse does not require malice, it only requires imbalance. This is not a warning meant to inspire fear. It is a reminder of responsibility. Wisdom is not measured by how much is known, but by how carefully knowledge is carried. Information without maturity fractures into belief, and belief without grounding turns rigid. The temptation to rush understanding has always been strong. Answers feel safer than uncertainty. Certainty feels like control, yet control has often proven more dangerous than ignorance when wielded without restraint. The uneasy realization settles quietly. Some truths do not destroy worlds on their own. People do, when they grasp without patience, interpret without humility, and act without wisdom. This awareness reframes the return of memory. Remembering is not inherently good or bad. Its effect depends entirely on how it is held. Knowledge does not liberate automatically. It reshapes power first. This is why readiness matters. Without it, rediscovery becomes disruption. Without integration, recognition becomes obsession. The same forces that once destabilized civilization could do so again, not through revelation, but through misinterpretation. The past remains unfinished, not because it lacks answers, but because answers require maturity to hold them without collapsing meaning. The overlap faded because humanity could not yet carry it without harm. This does not excuse ignorance. It explains delay. The audience is left not with fear, but with unease. A quiet awareness that knowing carries cost, that remembering demands responsibility equal to curiosity, that wisdom grows slower than information. The narrative prepares to turn inward now, away from history as subject and toward the listener as participant. The final movement does not ask what should be revealed, but who we become, if it is. With the risk acknowledged, curiosity deepens rather than accelerates. The desire for certainty gives way to attention. The weight of consequence replaces the thrill of discovery. And in this slowing, a different kind of readiness begins to form. The story does not close here. It changes posture. It stops reaching outward and begins listening inward. Because the most dangerous moment is not when truth appears, but when it is believed without wisdom. What follows will not be about gods, history, or evidence. It will be about responsibility, about how memory shapes action, about what happens when the past is no longer something we study, but something that begins to shape who we are becoming again. The final chapter waits in that space, not to reveal answers, but to ask whether humanity has learned enough restraint to carry them without repeating the cost that once demanded silence. There is another way to understand what has been described so far, one that does not require lost ages, vanished beings, or hidden realms. It requires a shift in perspective. The overlap between gods and humans may not have been a chapter in time at all. It may have been a state of being. In that earlier condition, reality was not divided the way it is now. Meaning was not separate from experience. Responsibility was not externalized. Humans did not wait for explanation before acting, nor did they outsource agency to distant forces. The sacred was not above life. It was within it, shaping perception rather than interrupting it. If this is so, then what disappeared was not presence, but orientation. The world did not change. Humans did. The way reality was interpreted narrowed. Attention collapsed inward. Perception shifted from participation to observation. What once felt alive and responsive began to feel distant and abstract. This reframing carries weight because it removes the comfort of nostalgia. The overlap was not stolen, it was relinquished. Not consciously, but gradually, as survival demanded separation, control, and certainty. Humanity learned to manage reality rather than engage with it. In doing so, it traded intimacy for predictability. The gods, in this view, did not depart. They lost relevance as perception changed. As humans began to see themselves as separate from forces around them, those forces became externalized, then symbolized, then dismissed. Divinity faded, not because it was false, but because the mode of relating to it no longer fit the emerging worldview. This perspective is unsettling, because it places responsibility where it cannot be avoided. If the overlap was a human state, then its absence is also human. The loss was not imposed. It emerged from adaptation. And what emerges from adaptation can, in theory, shift again. This does not promise return. It suggests capacity. The overlap may not be something that reappears through discovery or proof. It may re-emerge only through a change in how reality is perceived and engaged. Not by looking outward for beings, but by examining inward orientation. This reframing bypasses belief entirely. It does not require agreement about gods, origins, or history. It asks a different question. How does perception shape reality? What becomes visible when attention widens rather than narrows? In the earlier state, humans did not need intermediaries to feel connected. Meaning arrived through experience. Responsibility was immediate. Action mattered because consequences were felt directly, not deferred to doctrine or authority. Over time, that immediacy became overwhelming. Separation brought relief. Distance brought safety. Agency was distributed upward and outward. The world became manageable. But something essential was muted. The philosophical weight of this realization settles slowly. It suggests that the overlap did not belong to a forgotten era, but to a forgotten posture, a way of being that allowed deeper participation in reality at the cost of certainty. Modern humanity often mistakes control for maturity. Yet maturity may involve tolerating uncertainty without retreating into abstraction. The overlap, if internal, asks for responsibility rather than comfort. It asks humans to accept that meaning is not given, but co-created. This is why the realization lands quietly. It does not flatter. It does not accuse. It invites introspection. If the overlap never ended, only perception of it did, then remembering is not about retrieval. It is about orientation. The gods may have faded because humans learned to filter experience through categories that limited engagement. In narrowing perception, something expansive was lost. Not destroyed. Inaccessible. This framing changes the direction of the story. The question is no longer where the gods went, but how humans learned to stop seeing what once felt present. The boundary becomes internal rather than cosmic. The collapse becomes psychological rather than historical. If the overlap is internal, then responsibility shifts entirely onto humanity. There is no return without change, no restoration without maturity, no remembering without consequence. This is not revelation. It is invitation. An invitation to examine how perception shapes reality and how reality responds when perception shifts. The documentary arrives at this moment not to answer questions, but to place them closer to home. The overlap is no longer something that happened. It is something that may still be possible, not as event, but as condition. And from this point forward, the story is no longer about gods and history. It is about readiness. There is a quiet pattern running beneath every version of this story. It never truly ends. Myths stop mid-motion, records fracture without resolution, symbols endure long after meaning dissolves. The silence that follows is often treated as loss. But there is another way to understand it. Perhaps the story was not broken. Perhaps it was paused. Closure has weight. It settles questions into answers and replaces curiosity with certainty. For societies shaped by fragile balance, certainty can be dangerous. It hardens belief. It closes doors. An unfinished story does the opposite. It keeps attention alive. It invites return rather than obedience. Across cultures, the most powerful narratives resist conclusion. The gods withdraw without explanation. The golden age fades without detail. The cause of collapse is hinted at, never named. These omissions feel deliberate, as though something understood the risk of saying too much. An ending freezes meaning. A pause allows meaning to evolve. This restraint does not appear accidental. If the overlap between gods and humans had been fully explained, it could have become doctrine. Doctrine demands agreement. Agreement demands enforcement. The silence avoids this chain. It leaves space instead of command. The absence of answers frustrates the desire for certainty, yet it preserves freedom. Listeners must engage rather than submit. Each generation interprets fragments according to its capacity. No authority speaks from the past to dictate response. An unfinished story breathes. It adapts. It cannot be weaponized easily because it does not instruct directly. It suggests without ordering. It points without directing. This quality allows survival across time, without collapse into rigidity. Consider how myths end. They do not conclude with triumph. They dissolve. Gods depart. Worlds reset. Humanity continues, altered, uncertain. The silence that follows is heavy, but it is not empty. It carries invitation. The idea that the past left no answers feels uncomfortable because it removes guidance. Yet guidance can also limit growth. Answers stop seeking. Questions keep perception open. An unfinished story demands responsibility from the listener rather than compliance. This may be why explanation was always partial. Not because truth was hidden, but because certainty was withheld. Those who remembered too much understood that closure invites misuse. Silence protects complexity. In this light, forgetting was not failure. It was pacing. Memory was allowed to fade where it could harm more than help. The story slowed itself, waiting for capacity rather than demanding attention. The hypnotic quality of these narratives lies here. They circle, they pause, they breathe. They do not rush. They do not conclude. They hold space rather than fill it. This stillness draws attention inward. When silence is intentional, it becomes structure. Meaning does not vanish. It disperses. It enters habit, instinct, language, and expectation. The story survives without dominating. This reframing changes the emotional tone of loss. What felt like erasure becomes restraint. What seemed abandoned becomes patiently held. The past did not disappear. It stepped back. An unfinished story allows participation. Each listener completes it differently, according to maturity, curiosity, and responsibility. This prevents uniform interpretation. Diversity of meaning becomes strength rather than confusion. Perhaps this was the only way continuity could survive without control. A finished story would have claimed authority. An unfinished one invites dialogue. This silence also protects humanity from repeating mistakes prematurely. Without answers, no one can claim certainty. Without certainty, power remains limited. The unfinished nature of the story acts as a brake on domination. The stillness deepens as this realization settles. The pace slows. Language softens. There is nothing to resolve here. Resolution would break the balance that allowed the story to endure at all. The overlap was never meant to be recovered like an artifact. It was meant to remain experiential, relational, unfinished. Completion would have closed it permanently. By leaving the story open, the past ensured adaptability. It allowed future generations to approach it when ready, without instruction, without coercion. The silence preserved possibility. This understanding replaces frustration with patience. The absence of answers is not neglect, it is care extended across time. The story was left unfinished, so that it could never be finished for us, only with us. And now, as the rhythm slows toward the present moment, the realization becomes personal. The story has not been waiting for proof or rediscovery. It has been waiting for capacity. Capacity to hold uncertainty without fear. Capacity to listen without control. Capacity to engage without concluding. With no final answer offered, attention shifts gently to now. The silence no longer feels empty. It feels deliberate. And in that stillness, the unfinished story continues, not on the screen or in the past, but in the awareness of the listener, where meaning remains alive precisely because it has not been closed. All stories eventually reach a moment where they stop pointing backward, not because the past has been exhausted, but because attention can no longer remain there. What remains now is not an answer, but a responsibility. The question that once belonged to history, myth, and speculation has quietly crossed a boundary. It belongs to us. Not what happened, but what now. If there was once an overlap between humans and something greater, whether understood as gods, intelligence, presence, or perception, then its meaning was never confined to explanation. It carried obligation. It shaped how people acted, how they listened, how seriously they treated consequence. The fading of that overlap did not remove responsibility. It redistributed it. The past no longer asks to be uncovered like a secret. It asks to be responded to. Curiosity alone is no longer enough. Awareness brings weight. To recognize continuity without turning it into certainty requires restraint. To face mystery without turning it into authority requires humility. The overlap, reframed this way, becomes mirror rather than destination. It reflects humanity's relationship with the unknown. Do we seek understanding to dominate or to coexist? Do we pursue clarity to control or to deepen attention? Throughout this journey, the danger was never mystery itself. It was certainty without wisdom, control without listening, answers without context. The collapse that echoes through memory did not happen because the unknown was present. It happened because it was mishandled. Now the question returns differently. Not as belief or denial, but as posture. How do we hold what we cannot fully understand without rushing to own it? How do we allow curiosity without turning it into conquest? The silence at the end of this story is deliberate. There is no final claim because claims create hierarchy. There is no conclusion because conclusions demand agreement. Instead, there is space. That space is where responsibility lives. If the beginning feels close again, it is not because history has repeated. It is because awareness has widened enough to notice patterns without needing to define them. Recognition has replaced certainty. Attention has replaced explanation. The overlap was never something to be recovered like a lost artifact. It was never meant to be possessed. It existed as relationship, not object. When relationship became control, it fractured. When memory became authority, it hardened. What remains now is the chance to engage without repeating those mistakes. This is why the story cannot end. Ending would imply resolution, and resolution would close the door that has finally opened inward. The question no longer lives in ruins or records. It lives in perception. Can humanity look at mystery without turning it into dominance? Can curiosity remain gentle? Can awareness deepen without demanding ownership? The past has done all it can do. It has whispered, echoed, and waited. It has left fragments rather than instruction. It has resisted closure so that choice would remain alive. Now, the question does not ask for belief. It asks for maturity. If the overlap between gods and humans was ever real, it was real because it was relational. It demanded attentiveness rather than obedience. It required humility rather than certainty. And when those qualities faded, the overlap became unsustainable. The question that now belongs to us is quieter than the ones before it. It does not ask where the gods went. It asks how we respond to mystery when no authority speaks for it. What kind of humans do we become when answers are unavailable but awareness is present? The story releases here because it must. Anything more would instruct rather than invite. Anything less would close what should remain open. The beginning may not be behind us. It may be waiting, not as event, but as condition. Waiting to see whether humanity can stand within uncertainty without collapsing into fear or control. Waiting to see whether curiosity can mature into responsibility. Waiting to see whether the overlap, now internal, becomes something lived rather than believed. And in that waiting, the story continues not on the screen, not in the past, but in the quiet space where the listener decides what kind of awareness they are willing to carry forward, knowing that some questions endure not to be answered, but to be held.